All right, good morning. How is everybody? Oh, well, good. Good to see you. Be turning your Bibles to Esther, the 8th chapter. We'll study there, or we'll begin our study there. Are there any other announcements we need to make other than what's on the announcement sheet? I don't know of any. Okay, sure. As far as I know. That was I haven't gotten a text. Usually I get a text to the contrary. I have not gotten one to the contrary. The original plan was for him to be able to get out Thursday or Friday. He could get out. He has to wear a mask for 7 days, is what the doctor told him. But he was supposed to get out, and I haven't talked. I thought of that yesterday. I thought I hadn't talked to him. So, but I know that was the original plan. So, but that's a good question, and I'm assuming we have a song leader because I saw the songs on the sheet. So, anyway, any other announcements? All right, don't know of anything else either. All right, well, Esther, the 8th chapter. We're winding down Esther. Esther has 10 chapters, beautiful chapters, and we're in the midst, if you will, of the plan of Esther. This is a great story. This lady, through the help of others, saves the Jews. I mean, she's a strong lady. She's a courageous lady. She's faithful to her family and to her people. And she has this plan. Of course, Haman, we know the story. Just kind of remind you of it. Haman didn't like the Jews, didn't like Mordecai. You have a stereotypical mindset, or at least I do, and of what's going on and people. And I just see Haman as being a grouchy old person, you know, a mean old fella that decides he has a plan, and he's going to get rid of the Jews. He gets the king to sign a decree. Really, the king just says, tells Haman whatever you want to do. And so Haman has this decree signed by the king, so to speak, in which Jews were 11 months they were given, and the Jews were going to be annihilated. And word gets back to Mordecai, who had raised Esther. Esther now is part of Ahasuerus, the king of Persia. She's part of his harem, but Mordecai gets word, gives it to Esther, and that great question when he is asking her, go before the king, talk to the king. And she says, don't know if I want to, don't know if I can, don't know that he won't kill me. And the great question that's asked is, and Jim, there's your answer. The answer is yes, he's here. But the question is, who knows whether you are coming to the kingdom for such time as this? And so then she goes, and a plan is devised, and we're sort of in the midst of that plan in the 8th chapter as we get there to see how she goes about saving her people. So let's talk about this. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The interesting aspect of the last part of verse 1 to me is probably folks had figured this out, if not had been told. But it's interesting that now all of a sudden it's being told. How Mordecai, notice what it says, how Mordecai came before the king, for Esther has told him how they were related. Like I say, it probably was assumed, it probably was whispered about, it probably was told, but now all of a sudden the king has the story, and he has the story straight. Now, that's not to say that I endorse the idea of gossip, that I endorse the idea of telling about people when you don't know about them and you assume things and things aren't correct. And so when you begin to talk about people, you have to be very careful what you say about them. You have to be careful that what you say is what you know and not what you think. So whether Ahasuerus had not known to this point in time, don't know. But it is interesting that here in this text, it says, okay, Mordecai, now he comes before the king. He says, here's the story. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So the same ring that was given to Haman is now given to Mordecai. And Mordecai, notice that Esther appoints Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme, which he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. Now, let's just stop right there for a second. Remember, like you do, but remember this was sort of the welcoming, saying you can approach the king when the king put out his scepter towards someone. So Esther approaches Ahasuerus with, she wants to talk to him. She wants to get this evil, diabolical plan that Haman had put into practice, or put into starting the ball rolling, if you will, and she wants to put it to an end. And so she goes to the king. The king reaches forth his scepter in order to say, okay, you're welcome. You can talk. Let's talk. And so Esther, as she stood, there's 4 things that Esther gives out, really, with regards to reworking, if you will, the request or the law that Haman had so perpetrated by really sort of an absent king. Absent king, sort of just, okay, this can happen, and Mordecai gets his way, and now we're going to, or Haman gets his way, and now Mordecai and Esther are going to change that. But notice what she says. If it pleases the king, and if I found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. Now, she spells it out very plainly. She lays it on thick at the beginning, if you will. That's sort of expression that I was raised with. If it pleases the king, and if I pleased the king, and it said, if I'm pleasing to thy, then here's what I ask. And her request is really not that simple. In biblical times, when a Persian king, when he signed something into law or had something signed into law, that was it. You've heard of the law of the Medes and Persians? You don't change it. And so she's asking for something to be changed. And when she does, she says, here's what I want. She says, let it be written to revoke the letters that Haman devised. And then, verse 6, for how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? She said, I just can't bear to see my folks. I can't bear to see my folks annihilated. I can't bear to see my folks destroyed. I can't bear to see my folks endure what they'll have to endure, and then ultimately to end this. So then, verse 7, King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hands on the Jews. Now, I want to stop right here. This is interesting to me. And as I was reading this again last night, I got to thinking about it. And something is just interesting to me that you'd want, I don't think, we know the answer to what I'm about to say. But it seems as if what we studied last week, chapter 6 and 7, that Ahasuerus basically was upset at Haman for the fact that he had fallen upon Esther. Remember, he said, would he attack her even in my own home while I'm here? And so now the story is, I'm upset with Haman because of his hand in trying to kill the Jews. So, if we look at chapter 6 and 7, and we say, well, maybe that falling upon Esther was just part. That was the final blow. And maybe he was upset when he had finally heard, remember the story, remember how that Ahasuerus, the king, was so, if you will, so pleased with Mordecai when the Chronicles were read. And remember, he said, oh yeah, I remember where Mordecai saved me. He sent word to me, that there was a plot to overtake me. And when he had, remember the story, he had asked, have we done anything for Mordecai? Well, no. And so Haman, of course, is used by Ahasuerus as an instrument to glorify, if you will, to bring honor to Mordecai by parading him around. And well, now by the time we get here, Haman has been hung on his own gallows. Mordecai is now what would be, for lack of a better term, the prime minister. And so now all of a sudden, the king says he's involved. He says, no, wait a minute. We got rid of Haman because he tried to lay hands on the Jews. You yourselves, verse 8, write a decree concerning the Jews as you please. In the king's name, seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. There's an interesting statement in verse 8. Notice what he says. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please. The phrase as you please in Hebrew means according to what is good in your eyes. In other words, what pleases you. Now, that's very dangerous. And it's interesting that if you look at it and think about it, Ahasuerus has been the politician of his day, right? He sat back and he let Haman come up with this decree to annihilate the Jews. Now he's going to sit back and let Esther come up with this decree. And yes, he gives her the full, and Mordecai, he gives them the full responsibility. You get the decree signed, you get it written. Here's the seal, here's the signet ring, and he says, and it'll be what you say it is. And so the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, as it was written, according to tell that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, the princes of the provinces, from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in his own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. So it's been 70 days since Haman's decree is signed. Now, all of a sudden, we're having a new decree. Handwritten, written in the language of the people, of everybody, and so it is distributed to everybody. Same way that Haman's decree was signed and sealed and delivered to everyone, so this decree, which Mordecai and Esther have written, that is signed, of course, by the king's signet ring, as being official. They do the same thing as far as getting the word out that Haman did. And he wrote, in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, sent the letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses, bred from swift steeds. So this all made it authoritative. They were able to do what they wanted to do. And by the king's signet ring, by the king's courier, these letters or bills, if you will, were distributed amongst the people. And so it was authoritative. And then it says, verse 11, by these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or provinces that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. So if you come under attack, or as a Jew, or if you are an individual that attacks a Jew, you are, for lack of a better term, it's been okayed by the king. You can be killed. You can be put to death. Even women and children, it says. One day, verse 12, on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, and the 13th day, the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all the people, so the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who had rode on the royal horses went out, hastened, and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan. Remember, of course, this is the citadel, this is the palace, this is where the king resided, this is the place where it all has originated from anyway. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province, the city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Here's the results. Here's the outgrowth. Here's the good part, if you will, of what comes out of the edict that is signed now, the new edict, which basically tells Jews, if you come under attack, you can take the lives of individuals that have attacked you. First of all, notice that Mordecai's authority, it says Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white and great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. This showed the people that Mordecai has authority. And so one of the first things that is done is Mordecai is shown as being really next to the king. And then if you look in the last part of verse 15, it says Shushan rejoiced and was glad. There was rejoicing in Susa or Shushan, depending upon the version that you're using. And then verse 16, there's great rejoicing. There is not only just great rejoicing, but there is a special day. The last verse, or the middle of verse 17, talks about a feast and a holiday. The New King James Version uses the word holiday. Some versions use the idea or use the word good day. This was a special day. This was, in some ways, considered a great day nationally. And of course, we're going to look at the 9th chapter. We're going to see about this feast, this Purim. But notice that they've appointed this day as a day to remember, a day to honor, a day to celebrate. And so, then the last part of verse 17 is the fourth result of the edict. Many of the people of the land became Jews. Many of what would be considered the Gentiles converted. Now, let's think about that one for just a minute. in biblical times, in Old Testament times, you were considered either a Jew or a Gentile. The Gentile was considered the people, everybody else. And so part of the edict, when they found out, well, the Jews are all right. The Jews are going to be accepted. Nobody's going to kill them. Matter of fact, anybody that opposes the Jew can be killed. And so here, many of the Gentiles said, hey, Judaism doesn't sound so bad. We like Judaism. We believe Judaism. And so they converted. You might say, well, why? Well, it says because of fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now, you can look at that word fear and you can say, okay, some of them were afraid of them, and yes. You can also look at that word fear and it can be used from the standpoint of respect. And so these folks respected. Now, remember, the Persians had their own religious views. They weren't godly, and they had many gods. They were polytheistic. They weren't what we would call monotheistic, one God. They were polytheistic, many gods. And so they said, we like this system. We believe it, and we're wanting to follow it. And so some of them, out of respect, depending upon how you really want to view that word fear there, is kind of an interesting thought. But you have four things. Mordecai is seen as authority. You have this edict with regards to being made, this great rejoicing that occurred, of course, the holiday that was established, and then you have the fact that many of the folks were converted. And so then you have to find out, well, tell us a little bit more. Well, we're going to find out that some folks died. Chapter 9 is going to tell us that some of the Jews actually killed folks. And we'll see that in just a second. But notice and go back, it said in verse 11, it says anybody can be killed. We might look at that and we might say, well, that's a strange thing to say. That why would God allow his people to be defensive of themselves and their beliefs that they could actually kill people? Well, remember that God did that. God used evil people sometimes to defend his people. God allowed his own people to defend themselves. If you look at the decree that Mordecai and Esther, put those two together just for the sake of discussion, that Mordecai and Esther had written, it only changed a word or two, really, of what Haman had said in his decree. And so, very much the same thing. But it was Israel that God was interested in protecting. Because, go back to what we studied in Genesis, that was God's plan. That was God's people. And that this is God's plan working out. Now, you have, we're quite a few hundred years away from that, from Genesis. We're down in the 468, between 480 and 468 BC. And so we're really right towards the close time-wise of the Old Testament itself. The 400 years, remember, God revealed himself. What we have is the Old Testament. Then there's a period of 400 years of what folks call silence, in which God didn't reveal himself. And it's really between the closed time frame wise of the Old Testament and the beginning of what we call the New Testament, Christ coming to the scene. And there's 400 years in there that we know from a historical standpoint, we know some things. Things were written and things have been preserved, not inspired. But it is during that right before that time frame that we have the book of Esther. And so you have God, though, trying to preserve his people, because we got to get to Jesus, and we got to get then to Jerusalem, and we got to get Jesus on the cross, and we got to get to Pentecost. And if it hadn't been for Esther, we wouldn't have gotten there. Anything anybody like to say? Ask. On the earth, don't know. Persia had about 50 million people. Persia had about 50 million people and had, depending upon who you read, between 10 and 20 million, 50. Did I say 50,000? I'm sorry. Let me back up. Persia had 50 million people. The Jewish population has been estimated between 10 to 20 million. So 1/5 to 2/5 of the population.
How did Haman, Jews, get on opposite sides of any issue? Why did Haman hate the Jews so bad?
They don't know for sure, but it seems as if when you're reading the book of Esther, that it was the fact that Mordecai would not give him honor. Now, does that mean that the Jewish folks, not just Mordecai, but the whole Jewish nation, would not give Haman honor? I don't know.
It sounds like.
Yeah, I would go with that. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. The prophet, remember, God told Israel, he said, I'm not chosen you because you were more in number, but you were least, but because I loved you. And so that's the protection of God and the providence of God in all of this. Yeah. Very much so. Very true.
It's a far-fetched stretch to think that Haman did not know.
Yeah, I agree.
He was obsessed with Mordecai.
Yeah.
And being the source of Christians. The Jews have always been frivolous.
Mm-hmm.
Power is but when he fell on and then revealed that she was a Jew, and kill her.
Yeah.
That would have been
Yeah.
that was pretty much.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Are you in that day and age? You couldn't trust anybody. Of course, you can't today either.
A population that has a strong knit God relation within their families, and they have pretty strong order in the pecking of sons doing business and keeping those generational things going. That's a money legacy.
Sure.
That's power.
Sure.
More than rain.
Yeah.
Is it true that all Jews follow God?
The Jews were always tied to God. I'm going to bring this to modern day. The Jews were tied to God, but they didn't always practice God. It's sort of like today. There's a lot of folks call themselves Christians that aren't Christians, or are Christian in action. Let me put it that way. That's probably the best way of putting it.
And there are many fewer
Yeah.
Judaism.
Sure.
Bible verse says, and many of them became Jews because they thought, don't want to mess with these people. Somebody will be one of them.
The accounting that I got was before. Yeah. Before the 8th chapter or the event of.
Strange. In the 9th chapter, it says they killed 75,000.
Yeah.
75,000 people, the ones who are going to go kill 10 to 20 million people.
Right. And I even read, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I even read somewhere where there's a debate, and I didn't have time to go through all the references, that it's not 75, that it's 15,000, not 75,000. Yeah, amongst, theological circles. So I haven't had time to research that, but that's interesting.
So that would have been.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Sure. That I know. Yeah. Yeah.
So Haman's edict was for the 80% not Jews, kill the 20% Jew, not just my followers or my ancestors, their personal revenge against the Jews, and the rest of you Persians can sit this one out because you don't have a dog in the hunt, you weren't part of it and all that little bit.
Right. Yeah, it's an annihilation, a complete annihilation of the Jews. And that's part of why this story is so beautiful, is that it's showing God's protection of his people. And it's a shame that we don't study Esther more, because it really does show the providence of God. Anything else?
How does that relate to God's protection for the Jews?
Yeah.
Does that say that at the end of the Old Testament, God's protection of the Jews ceased? Because this story has such a great parallel with World War II and Hitler's rise to power.
Yeah.
And his desire to completely annihilate the Jews.
Right.
But history tells us God didn't intervene there.
Right. Yeah. God, the best answer I can give you for that, because I can only speak where God has given me word. God protects his people. And who are his people today? To be honest, that's not a satisfying answer, I know. We do the best we can. Yeah, because, like I said, when we get finish the 10th chapter of Esther, I'm going to figure out this week how many weeks we're going to spend on the providence of God. And I just tell you right now, I think we can all say, because we've all studied the providence of God before, but we can all say that as we study the providence of God, there are more questions than there are answers. We're studying angels on Wednesday night. Are angels used in the providence of God? And if so, how? Well, I can't give you a firm answer to that. It seems as if they're ministering spirits, and it does seem as if they're used by God, but how? The Bible doesn't say. How does God work everything together for good? I'm not sure I really understand that. And sometimes you just have to say what you can say and just let ignorance go, and it's all right to say I don't know. And I'll discuss that when we get there, because that's part of, I can already tell you, that's part of the introduction of the study. Anything else? All good. All right. Well, let's look in the 9th chapter then. Now, in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day, time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. If you go back to the 3rd chapter, you look also again at the 8th chapter, you find out they were both to be executed on the same day. Both decrees were to be executed on the same day. And so it says that the time come for the king's command and his decree to be executed on that day. The enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. The opposite occurred, and the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all people. So you have a gathering of an army, really. That's the word there for gathered in verse 2, the very beginning, the Jews gathered together. The Hebrew word has the meaning of the gathering of an army. So they've gathered an army together, and they're going to get all those who sought to do them harm. Verse 3, and all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. All right, well, here we have a question. Let's look at the verse, and then I'll raise the question. Notice that it says that all these officials helped the Jews. The word helped, the Hebrew word, means lifted up. They lifted up the Jews because of the fear of Mordecai. Now, there were various royals and various officials that said, okay, we now listen to Mordecai. Mordecai had become the prime minister. He was the second, what was seen as the second in command. And so there is this fear, if you will, for his authority, his position, and what he might do to them or could do to them. And so they began to fall in line because of their fear. So then you look at verse 3, and here's the question. And I don't have an answer to this question, by the way, but you might. And that's wonderful. I'd like to hear it. Was there support of Mordecai? Was it a military support, or was it moral support? I don't have an answer for that. You might, like I said, you might. But the scriptures don't tell us. But all of a sudden, they changed their tune. Oh, we're going to listen to Mordecai. Now, you wonder, don't know, you wonder how many of these folks had been, so to speak, in the back room just earlier, laughing about Mordecai and laughing about the Jews. Now, all of a sudden, they see the power of Mordecai, see the power that his people are reigning, and all of a sudden, oh, well, we kind of like them. They're not bad people. They're our neighbors. And so you see this conversion, if you will. And Mordecai, it says in verse 4, was great in the king's palace. He was powerful. The word great has the idea of powerful. He had, when you get down to it, he had assumed Haman's role. He was great in the king's palace. His fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man, Mordecai, became increasingly prominent. So all of a sudden, his service, and he's been serving now, it seems as if we can, in fixing this calendar through the book of Esther, that we're now 9 months into him being in this role. Folks are more and more, they're hearing. And they realize the power that he wields. And so they're listening, and they're, okay, let's give in. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. They destroyed their enemies at will. They destroyed them. And notice how Esther characterizes this. With the stroke of the sword, slaughter, and with destruction. And what we saw a while ago in the 8th chapter, verse 11, didn't matter whether it was male or female or children, whoever it was. We have to be careful. We can't lay the blame of what our forefathers did at our feet, unless we are perpetuating the same thing. Now, that's to say this, that one of the traits of today is that all of a sudden, and it varies from group to group. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to single out any one group, but it's to say we're wrong based upon what others did before us. I was in a workshop on Monday, and the speaker was recommending a book. It's an academic book. I probably won't get it. But he was talking about what he called deconstructionism that is occurring amongst individuals in the church today that would be considered the millennials. And not all of them, don't get me wrong, just some. But it's the idea of trying to interpret the Bible not based upon what things happened then and the way they happened then, but based upon the things of today. And you can't do that. You have to go back, and as the old analogy that I was taught so many times in undergrad, you have to put on, all our teachers would take their glasses off, you have to put on first century glasses and look at the Bible through the first century. We have to remember that the Bible was written at a time for specific people. Does it still apply to us today? Absolutely. Is the authority that is found, say, in the New Testament, is it still applicable to us today? The answer is yes. Are we still to follow it? The answer is yes. We still listen to it? Yes. But we have to interpret it, what it said, from the standpoint of Paul, let's just use Paul's epistles. Paul was writing to the people of his day based upon the problems and the things that they were facing at that time. We can take that and then, of course, apply all that to our life. But it's not to say that we can go back and try to interpret that based upon what's happening in the 21st century. Can't do that. That's not fair. It's not right. And so we look all of a sudden the hand of the Jewish folks there is heavy. And as it's heavy, it goes about trying to, so to speak, clear out the house of those that were opposed to them. And so it flips the script. And then it says in verse 6 that in Shushan or Susa, I've been saying Shushan just because the New King James, that's the word it uses. Some of the more modern versions use the word Susa. It's the same place. Shushan, the citadel, remember the palace location. The Jews killed and destroyed 500 men also, and there's the names. They're the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. They killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. There's an interesting aspect. And that's where we're going to stop. Yeah, we'll probably just stop right there. It's a good place to stop. But so now what we have is the killing of the Jews. But notice that he doesn't take the plunder. Wonder why that is. They were more interested, this is the way I see it. They were more interested in making sure that the people were preserved. They were doing it from a standpoint of they didn't want the ethnicity cleansing, if you will, sort of like what Hitler was trying to do as well. They didn't want that. What they wanted was to be sure that they all stood on the same ground. They didn't want the money. They just wanted to make sure that they were all fine, treated well, equal. And there are, of course, some modern day historical parallels that go along with that. Anything else? Yes.
They were allowed Haman's people to take plunder of everything. Also told to kill children.
Yeah.
Were you instructed to kill the women and children?
That's the great question. Seems like chapter 8, verse 11 and 12 says yes. Well, that is the great moral question, really, if you study chapter 8 and chapter 9, that is the one of the things that theologians that sit around and do nothing but talk all day long and argue, that's one of the things that they want to argue about. But it seems to me, if in chapter 8, that the decree allowed for the killing of children and the killing of women. Sure does. Sure does.
There was no peace. There was no forgiveness.
No.
There was no healing.
That's right.
It was still territorial war ground.
That's right.
And maybe that's why God didn't respond in the Holocaust with them.
Yeah.
Because the Jews' response for leadership in the kingdom of Xerxes was not godly.
Right. No. That's well put. Yeah. Anything else?
All we talked about was Jews gathering together for this day. That would have been in each province, each town, each whatever, so it would have been like a national army, local bands or whatever.
Yeah.
And they could only defend themselves against people who came with them, correct? They just couldn't go blindly go, I'm going to go take this house out and kill everybody.
Appears as if, but there's a wondering, if you will, I guess, of saying, because it said anybody that opposed them. So would it have been possible for them to? Yeah. It seems as if it would have been possible, and did they? Probably so. Yeah, the Purim then that we're fixing to, when we get just a little bit further down in the 9th chapter, becomes a national holiday. And it's still, certain of the Jews still keep it. Not all, but most of them do keep Purim, which is interesting. It's the only feast, if you think about it, or holy day, that is not mentioned, say, Leviticus. So it's added later, years later. And it's the only one added, and it's, like I say, it's still kept today, which is interesting because part of that festival that is kept today, part of it is they sit down and read the whole book of Esther, which is an interesting aspect. If you go back and look at the Jewish holidays, we'll use that for lack of a better term, most of them center around some reading of Scripture of some kind. And it's just interesting because our holidays are centered around hot dogs and hamburgers and grill outs and stuff like that. Anything else? All right. Well, good stuff. I appreciate y'all. Y'all help keep me on my toes, and I keep studying because of you, and I hope you keep studying. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day. We're thankful for the love that you have for us, for the way that you watch over us. Thankful for this good book, for truly it shows your hand and your might. And it shows the fact that you do use people for your good. And we ask that you will be with us and that you'll always hold to us as we hold to you. And that truly your work will be in our life so that we can shine forth to others. We ask that you be with those that are sick. We ask that you be with those that are taking care of them as well. We ask that you watch over us and bless us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Thank you. They're coming.